It's the Halloween season, which means a lot of videos listing scary video game music. And would anyone really be surprised if it's just a bunch of organ tracks? Well, we're gonna do something similar, but instead of talking about how scary the organ is, we're gonna talk about why the organ is used for those tracks. And is it actually the organ that makes that music scary? As far as video game soundtracks go, there are essentially two main situations in which you would expect to hear organ music: churches and bosses. The first one makes sense, although most people probably have the chronology backwards. The earliest version of an organ originated in around 200 BCE in Greece, centuries before Christianity gained a foothold in Europe. The eventual integration of organs into churches was not a matter of worship or theology, but more logistics. Around the 10th century, cathedrals were not just worship spaces, but centers for education and cultural advancement, and it just so happened that the monks were fascinated by something that required such mechanical ingenuity as the organ. From that point on, organs began to be used in worship services because why not? They were there and worked exceptionally well to support singing, and since they were powered by wind, they aligned with a theological concept of inspiration from the Holy Spirit. So we understand when presented with a scene in a church that the organ is a sound we expect to hear, or even a scene evoking a church vibe, like this outdoor wedding in the Breath of the Wild. But for this video, we're more interested in the second group, bosses and powerful enemies. But my first question is this: is the organ an inherently spooky instrument? Intimidating, sure, but actually scary? Many people would probably say yes, and summon up aural images of toccata and fugue in D minor, which has been linked to the horror genre since the early days of silent film accompaniment. However, people whose familiarity with the instrument spans broader than a single work might say no, of course not. In fact, the organ has the widest range of sounds and timbres of any instrument, and there are certainly examples we can hear this with. To appreciate the conversation about boss music, we need to do a little bit of background on how the organ makes sounds. The organ is a wind instrument, which is why you get all those pipes. Although it looks like a piano keyboard, it functions entirely differently. When you press a key on the piano, a hammer strikes a string to create the tone. When you press a key on an organ, a slider which covers the mouth of the pipe is moved, allowing air to enter and make sound. Each pipe makes one particular sound on one particular pitch, so you need a lot of them. What kind of sound is made depends on what type of pipe is used. There are four basic types of organ sounds: flutes, reeds, strings, and principals. The first three are fairly self-explanatory about what they sound like, while principal pipes are that distinctive organ sound that most people think of. The principal pipes are the ones we most often hear in the soundtracks in question. I've seen other videos that mistakenly refer to these as great pipes, but that actually refers to a division of the organ rather than a type of pipe. Organ pipes are divided into groups, typically the great, which is the biggest, swell, which is enclosed, and sometimes a choir, where you might find more solo-style stops. However, most organs feature a chorus of principal pipes on every division. But it isn't just the type of pipe that's used that matters, but how many are used. All the numbers on organ stops refer to the octave that sounds when the note is played. The 8-foot indicates that it plays at pitch. Middle C on an 8-foot principal would be the same as middle C on a piano. The 4-foot indicates a pipe half as long, meaning that the same key would sound like the octave higher on a piano. 2-foot would be another octave higher, while 16-foot would be an octave lower, etc. So you should be realizing something very exciting about the organ now. If you had 16, 8, 4, and 2-foot stops pulled, you could play 4 different octaves of a note by only pressing one key. If you played a triad, those 3 notes would sound like 12. You can make a lot of noise on the organ for fairly minimal effort because of this, and it's a fairly bright tone. But it doesn't stop there, because there are sets of stops called mixtures, which add even more notes. The 4-rank mixture is one of the most common and adds another 4 notes for each key played. Middle C with this stop on would sound as C and G but in higher octaves. So you can imagine how many notes would play if you pressed all these keys together. So we're starting to get at the answer to our first question here. Strong enemies, boss fights, large arenas. These all have in common this sense of grandeur, authority, and power that can be accomplished by the organ with this particular registration. Its tangible application of the overtone series also means that dissonance on the organ is particularly itchy, which is why fully diminished chords and clusters set us on edge, and why a resolution to a major chord feels so miraculous. Perhaps one of the most iconic appearances of the organ is in Ocarina of Time, as Link climbs Hyrule Tower for the final face-off with Ganondorf. As we ascend, the organ becomes louder and more insistent until it's revealed that Ganondorf himself has been accompanying our rise through his lair. Though now you should realize that there are far too few pipes on this organ for the notes you've been hearing. Here are a couple other examples of thick organ textures featuring principals and mixtures. This one checks off a couple boxes, since it's set in a church and a powerful enemy, so you get the organ combined with bells and a choir, all the elements of a cathedral battle. In a similar vein, the fight against the first vicar of the healing church features choir with the organ as well, as it crawls around these chords that build intensity. Now, you may be thinking, there are a whole lot of tracks I can think of that use the organ that he didn't mention. And you would be right so far. I've gone through a lot of organ tracks in video games and discovered a fascinating trend. Most of them don't actually take advantage of the organ's ability to build thick, powerful blocks of chords, but instead take heavy influence from the German Baroque style. Remember earlier when I mentioned how toccata and fugue in D minor is almost inextricably associated with the horror genre now? It seems that this association has inspired composers throughout the decades to emulate Bach's compositional practices anytime they want to evoke power and awe. So first of all, what is the German Baroque style? It's characterized by a constant subdivision pulse. Other European styles from this period are noteworthy for various elements, but a clock-like measuring of time in music is noticeably German. Those stereotypes about precision and engineering didn't come from nowhere. J.S. Bach is generally acknowledged to be the most prolific and skilled composer in this style. You may hear composers or other videos tell you that these tracks are essentially all toccatas based on the famous D minor, but that isn't quite accurate. For starters, the D minor is actually a pretty poor representation of the German style, having more in common with an Italian toccata with its short bursts of flourish and limited overarching thematic ideas. Modern scholars even doubt Bach's authorship or attribute it to him at a very young age. Also, there is limited use of the organ pedals. You know, that part of the organ Ganondorf just doesn't have. Pedals were a relatively late addition to organs, and predominantly found on German organs. So much so that when Felix Mendelssohn, composer of the famous Wedding March, was asked by England to write a set of organ pieces in 1845, he mistakenly included a very elaborate pedal line, not realizing that most English organs still did not have a full pedal board. Toccatas in the style of the D minor are actually not all that well suited for boss fights, and I'll show you an example. The final battle of Death Smiles actually uses the D minor toccata. As you can hear, it's short snippets of impressive figurations with pauses between, and doesn't actually do much to build intensity and energy throughout the fight. In contrast, the German Baroque style you'd hear in a fugue or prelude is characterized by having an almost incessant flow of 16th notes, really effective for creating driving energy. Compare the opening of Bach's Prelude in C minor with the final Bowser fight from Super Mario 64. As another example, here's Bach's Prelude in A minor compared with the Sorceress Battle from Kirby Canvas Curse. There are countless examples of this style of writing in organ tracks, which is a little interesting when you consider that there are a lot of instruments that can play a fast rock style, but very few that can sustain a massive wall of sound like the organ can. You can find all sorts of videos with top organ tracks in video games countdowns, and I encourage you to now that you have a bit of an idea of what you're listening for, but that's not what I'm doing here. Now it's true that pretty much all of these have been in minor, which may have something to do with the scariness of it, but I will serve you up one of the most impressive uses of organ in any boss fight, and of course it's from the inimitable Nobuo Uematsu, Dancing Mad from Final Fantasy VI. The boss fight is 4 stages, entirely accompanied by organ, with additions of choir throughout, until the final phase when all rock and roll hell breaks loose. But to show my point, here is the music from the 3rd phase. Out of the flurry of battle emerges this masterclass of contrapuntal writing in a major key. The influence of Bach is unmistakable here, especially when we hear Kefka's theme enter in the pedals. It does switch back to minor ultimately, but the moment of major mode clarity in the midst of battle is really striking. To further demonstrate my point, listen to this excerpt from Dancing Mad compared to an excerpt from this Bach work. You may recognize this. It's not the toccata in D minor, it's the fugue, once again characterized by running 16th notes. Now I would be remiss if I didn't point out 2 very distinctive tracks, Passacaglia from Suikoden and Chaconne C-moll from the Saturn version of Castlevania Symphony of the Night. You can hear a lot of the type of figuration we've already looked at in both of these, but they reference very specific compositional forms. Both the Passacaglia and Chaconne were originally dances, believed to originate in Spain, although the Chaconne may have come from Mexico. Regardless, by the time of Bach they had become fairly distinctive instrumental works as well. Both of these forms are characterized by a repeating figure in the bass, either a melodic gesture or harmonic progression. The difference is that in a Passacaglia, this figure can migrate to other voices, while in a Chaconne it remains grounded in the bass. In this case, Castlevania's is in fact also more of a Passacaglia, drawing heavy inspiration from Bach's own Passacaglia in C minor. Go check these tracks out and hear for yourself the repeating bass progression. In any case, there is my argument. It's not the organ that makes this music scary, it's the Germans. Just kidding. It is the organ, whose distinctive principal chorus sound has become embedded in our cultural ears as signifying something looming, powerful, and dangerous. However, it is undeniable that the influence of the German Baroque style, and more specifically Bach, has had a heavy hand in these composers' imaginations. I hope you enjoyed this video about organ music, and maybe you learned something about both the inner workings of the instrument as well as the stylistic elements of a huge portion of its repertoire. Let me know in the comments what else you'd like to hear about on this topic, subscribe for more content, and I'll see you next time.